She walked into a luxury showroom, a black woman in her 80s, unnoticed and unwelcomed. Moments later, the police were called. But what they didn't know was that she owned the land beneath their feet. And what happened next exposed a truth they never saw coming. Dear viewer, what you are about to witness is not just a story. It is a powerful testament to the quiet power and pursuit of justice in places most people ignore. If this is your first time here, I warmly invite you to share where you are watching in the comments below. And if stories like this move you, challenge you, or make you think, consider subscribing and clicking the bell icon. We share voices that deserve to be heard every day. Thank you for being here. Now let's get into the story. Under a sky washed in the early gold of morning, a narrow road cut through downtown Atlanta, where glass buildings shimmered like fragile pride. The city stirred quietly, coffee cups, clinked tires whispered over asphalt, voices hummed in the distance. But inside the Sterling Legacy Auto Showroom, an eruption was about to begin. It would start not with a crash or a scream, but with something far more dangerous, the presence of a woman who wasn't supposed to exist. She didn't look like power. That was her crime. She walked through the showroom doors alone, her steps neither hurried nor hesitant. A simple black coat draped her hunched frame. Her gray curls peeked from beneath a worn cloche hat. Her skin, deep and warm as coffee grounds, was lined with the years of endurance. She could have been anyone, just another elderly black woman passing through the city, unseen, unknown, easily dismissed. But what they didn't realize, what none of them could have guessed, was that this quiet figure once changed the course of an entire industry. And she hadn't come to admire the polished chrome. She had come to remember and to test if the world she helped build had truly changed. Her name was Miss Lillian May Carter, 84 years old. Once the founding soul behind Carter Motors, now hidden behind layers of corporate rebranding. Her name had been scrubbed from the plaques. Her legacy erased by time and silence. The dealership she stood in, proud, gleaming state-of-the-art, had been hers decades ago. But none of the young suited employees recognized her. Why would they? She no longer fit their image of influence. They saw a grandmother. The air was coldly sterile, filled with the scent of waxed floors and ambition. Lillian walked past the waiting lounge where customers with Rolex watches and tailored blazers sipped designer water. She drifted toward the luxury section, cordoned off by red velvet ropes, where a Rolls-Royce Phantom glowed like something celestial. The car didn't move her. What struck her, what pinned her to that very spot, was the mirror-like reflection on its hood, her own weathered face, and behind it, the ghost of a girl who once refused to be broken. That's when the voices started, a sharp cough of disapproval, a pair of polished shoes clicking closer, a white officer's voice cold as steel. "Ma'am, this area is restricted. Step away from the vehicle." The badge gleamed. His voice held no malice, just the casual authority that comes with being believed. A second officer appeared beside him, taller arms folded. Both wore expressions, too familiar, half courtesy, half suspicion. To them she was not a customer, not a guest, merely an elderly black woman in the wrong place. "I was just looking," Lillian said softly. One of them smirked. "Sure you were." Within moments, what had been a silent showroom became a chamber of whispers. Salespeople exchanged nervous glances. A manager appeared, called over by one of the officers. His smile was practiced. "Ma'am, we need you to wait over there while we verify something. It's just procedure." Procedure. The word sliced through her. How many times had she heard that excuse used as a cloak for fear, for prejudice? She had watched it for decades, how dignity unraveled under the weight of suspicion. She had built this place, brick by brick, with sweat and genius and sheer will. And now all it took to erase her was two uniforms and a single word. They didn't ask her name. They didn't ask what she wanted, because in their eyes, she already didn't belong. And yet she said nothing. She stood still, letting the scene unfold. The showroom, the velvet ropes, the chrome reflections, all of it pulsed with memory. Her silence wasn't defeat. It was calculation. She had learned long ago that sometimes power doesn't rise in noise, but in the stillness before a storm. Outside, the city kept moving. Inside, the tension thickened. Someone whispered, "Should we call it in?" Another nodded, just to be safe. Safe. That word again. As if her presence were a threat. As if her skin carried danger. And in that instant, everything began to fracture, not just the moment, but the myth that Sterling Auto was built on fairness and progress. Because standing in that gleaming glass showroom was the ghost of a truth they'd tried to bury, that the person they were about to humiliate, to remove, to accuse, was the very foundation they stood on. Miss Lillian May Carter smiled, but not kindly. What none of them knew was that she wasn't here by accident. She had waited years for this return. Today was the anniversary of the day she signed the first deed. 50 years ago. She had come not for revenge, but for reckoning. And when the truth came out, when the cameras revealed what the officers had done, when the media swarmed, when the CEO arrived, late and breathless, it would be too late. The damage would already be done. Because in a country that claims to remember its heroes, how quickly do we forget the ones who don't look like power? How easily do we erase those who don't fit the image? The showroom didn't just misjudge a customer. It had declared war on a legacy. And this time, Miss Carter wasn't leaving quietly. Mason Tran had been assistant manager at Sterling Legacy Auto for just under a year. Young, ambitious, always in a hurry to impress, he wore his blazer like armor and carried his clipboard like a compass, hoping it would navigate him toward promotion. On that particular morning, when the showroom's silence was broken by the arrival of two police officers and a slow-moving woman in a black coat, Mason was reviewing a service audit in his office upstairs. At first, he ignored the buzz. Commotion wasn't uncommon in a showroom where luxury collided with entitlement. But something about the way his team whispered, about how the energy in the room turned heavy, made him glance toward the floor-to-ceiling glass panel that overlooked the main hall. He saw her, not the police, not the gathered staff, just her. The old woman standing near the Rolls-Royce, back straight, hands steady. The officers didn't touch her, not physically, but they were doing something else, an unspoken escalation, the kind Mason had seen before in news clips, in civil rights documentaries, and in family stories, told in hushed tones. He couldn't hear the exact words, but body language screamed louder than dialogue. One officer's stance, the tightening jaw of a salesperson, the discomfort blooming like sweat on the showroom floor. Mason stood frozen, torn by instinct. Part of him, the part trained in corporate risk mitigation, said to stay out of it. Let the police handle it. She wasn't a scheduled guest, wasn't on the list for test drives or VIP appointments. Procedure said observe, de-escalate, don't interfere. Another part of him, the quieter part, buried under years of towing lines, said this wasn't right. He watched her. Watched the moment she was asked to leave. Watched how she didn't flinch, didn't argue, didn't cry. She just stood there, wrapped in something stronger than pride. Dignity. That kind of grace didn't come from weakness. It came from endurance. That was when Mason noticed the way the officers looked at her like a nuisance, not a threat, not a danger. Just an interruption they didn't want to deal with. His fingers clenched the edge of his desk. He almost walked away. He almost returned to his reports, told himself it wasn't his business, that getting involved would be inappropriate. The dealership had rules about public confrontations, about media optics, about hierarchy. But even as those excuses lined up like shields, Mason knew every person who ever almost did something to stop injustice was one more silent witness too many. Downstairs, a young sales trainee named Elena Cruz had already pulled out her phone. She stood behind a pillar, quietly recording. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but conviction. She didn't look around for permission. Mason finally descended the stairs when it was over, when the officers had led the woman out, with a cold detachment reserved for loiterers and trespassers. She hadn't argued, hadn't resisted, and still they treated her like something suspicious, like a box left unattended in a train station. He approached Elena, who looked stricken. "Did you get all of it?" he asked quietly. She nodded. "I didn't know what else to do." "You did something," he replied. Later that night, long after the showroom closed, Mason sat in his office and watched the footage. No filters, no polish, just raw discomfort. The woman never raised her voice, never broke posture, but the officer's tone, their suspicion, their dismissal was unmistakable. The video showed more than a misunderstanding. It showed a belief that some people simply don't belong in certain places. The timestamp blinked in the corner, 9:14 a.m. He replayed the moment when one of the officers muttered, "Let's keep this clean, no scene," as if her very presence was dirt. Mason stared at the screen, the silence around him as loud as thunder. He hadn't intervened, hadn't even asked her name, and that more than the officer's behavior haunted him. He didn't sleep that night. The next morning she returned, not with police, not with anger, just with a quiet presence that somehow made the room feel like a courtroom. She walked through the door again, alone, past the same velvet ropes, past the same staff, who now stiffened and stepped back. And when she reached Mason, standing near the front desk, with Elena beside him, she asked a single question. "What did you see?" Not what happened. Not what will you do. Just that. "What did you see?" Mason struggled to answer. "I saw something I should have stopped." She nodded just once and handed him a folded piece of paper. No words, no threats. Inside was a copy of a deed dated decades earlier, signed by one name, Lillian May Carter. She turned and walked out again, this time not escorted, not ashamed. Mason stared at the document, the signature clear, unmistakable. He knew in that moment that what had happened wasn't just a bad look for the company. It was a moral failure. And worse, it was familiar. This wasn't the first time someone had been silenced in a place they helped build. It wouldn't be the last, unless someone decided to stop looking away. He went to the CEO the next day, told the truth, showed the video, played the audio, quoted the exact words, told him who Lillian Carter really was. And when the CEO began to talk about PR strategies, Mason cut him off. "This isn't a brand issue. This is a justice issue." By the time news broke, by the time national headlines screamed about legacy racism and erasure, Mason had already written his own public statement. He didn't defend himself. He didn't hide behind policy. He just told the story of a morning he almost walked away and why he never would again. Because silence is a choice, and so is courage. Lillian Carter gave him both. The ink had long since faded from the deed, but the name remained. Bold, curved, firm. Lillian May Carter. The document had sat quietly in her cedar-lined box for decades, untouched, except on rare Sundays when she'd open the folds with fingers more reverent than fragile. She never displayed it, never bragged. It wasn't proof for the world. It was proof for herself that she had built something in a time when the world insisted she could own nothing. Back in 1972, when Sterling Legacy Auto was still just a dream, drawn in pencil, Lillian was already knee-deep in grit and ledger sheets. She was one of the earliest investors, a quiet force. She poured her late husband's pension into the business and the last of her savings from cleaning courthouse offices at night. She believed in the idea before it had chrome signs and champagne unveilings. And because she knew paperwork meant permanence, she made sure her name sat beside the founding partners on the land acquisition deed. But when the showroom was completed in 1975, her name slowly disappeared from the narrative, then from the invitations, then as if by design, from memory. People said the company was built by grit and vision. They meant men. They meant white men. Lillian never fought for recognition. That wasn't her way. She was more comfortable in work boots than heels, more at ease sweeping tile than cutting ribbons. But she never forgot the brick her hands helped lay. And she never let her granddaughters forget either. That's why the morning after Mason Tran finally read her deed and understood what it meant, Lillian Carter returned to Sterling Legacy Auto not to demand attention, but to reclaim truth. She wore the same coat. The receptionist froze when she walked in. But this time, no one tried to stop her. They watched her cross the same polished tiles, her steps slow but certain. Mason emerged from his office, flanked by Elena Cruz and two other team members who had begun circulating the video internally. No corporate PR handlers, no press, just people who'd seen something and couldn't unsee it. Lillian didn't waste words. She pulled the deed from her bag and placed it on the front desk. This name, she said softly, should have never been erased. Mason nodded. "We know," he replied. "We're not letting that happen again." What followed in the days after felt like a slow tremor, a disturbance that rippled through the dealership's polished public image. News outlets caught wind of the story. An elderly black woman, once part owner of the company removed by police from the very building her name helped establish. The video resurfaced online and racked up views by the millions. And when a reporter from the Atlanta Chronicle called Lillian for a statement, she declined the interview. "I don't want a headline," she told Mason privately. "I want restoration." The next week, Sterling's board held an emergency meeting. It wasn't easy. Some argued for damage control. Others pushed for silence, hoping it would blow over. But then Mason brought the deed, placed it at the center of the table, and simply said, "This is our foundation." There was no legal fight, no media stunt, just paperwork and the power of its proof. Within 2 weeks, the company issued a formal statement acknowledging Lillian Carter as a founding investor. Her name was restored to the official company history. A plaque was commissioned not for vanity, but for accountability. But what mattered most to Lillian wasn't the press release. It was the letter, hand-delivered to her home by Mason, sealed in a white envelope embossed with the Sterling Legacy logo. It read, "Dear Ms., Lillian May Carter. This company stands today on ground you helped shape. We apologize for forgetting. We honor your name now and always. Below the typed text were signatures, every board member, every department head, every sales lead. But it was Mason's that came with a handwritten note in the margin. I almost looked away. You made me see again. Lillian pressed the paper to her chest. Her eyes closed, breath trembling. She had no tears left to cry. Not for herself, but for the many names still buried, still forgotten, still waiting to be spoken aloud. That Sunday, she returned to the old church off Auburn Avenue, the one with the chipped stained glass windows and the choir that never missed a note. She wore her Sunday hat, the one she hadn't worn in years. And when the pastor invited anyone forward with testimony, Lillian didn't speak. She walked slowly to the altar, held up the deed in both hands, and the room packed with old friends and strangers alike stood to their feet, not in pity, not in sympathy, but in recognition, not just of her, of every name they knew had once mattered and had been forgotten. Lillian didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The deed had finally spoken for itself. It wasn't the siren that startled the neighborhood. It was the silence that followed, the kind that sinks into your skin and stays there. By the time Officer Darren Coyle and his unit pulled up to the curb outside Sterling Legacy Auto, the protest had already begun. It wasn't a riot. It wasn't loud. Just a few dozen people standing shoulder to shoulder holding up hand-drawn signs, honor her name. History can't be erased. This is her land, and at the center of it all, standing still in the Georgia morning sun, was Lillian May Carter. Her cane was planted like a post in the ground, her back straight, her eyes unblinking behind thick oval glasses. She didn't shout. She didn't move. She was the stillness the world had forgotten how to respect. The badge approached without pause. "Ma'am, you're obstructing private property," Coyle said, voice measured and devoid of warmth. Two other officers flanked him, hands resting lightly on their belts. "This is not private property," Lillian replied evenly. "This land bears my name." Coyle didn't look at the paper she held, didn't ask for clarification. He looked through her, saw not a woman, not an elder, not even a person, but a problem. And when people become problems, protocol becomes performance. He moved in without warning. The crowd gasped as the officer gripped Lillian's wrist, firm and dismissive. Her cane clattered to the sidewalk. Her body jerked slightly, but her gaze remained firm. Elena Cruz, watching from the dealership window, ran outside. Mason followed. "She has a legal right to be here," Elena shouted. Coyle didn't hear her, or chose not to. That's what people like him had been taught, that compliance isn't something you listen for, it's something you extract. He turned Lillian by the shoulder as if she were furniture. Mason stepped forward. "That's enough," he barked, voice hard and unfamiliar even to himself. The officer paused just long enough for the cameras to start recording. One bystander had already been live streaming. Another caught the moment the officer's sunglasses slipped low enough to reveal his eyes, calm, calculating, and cold. When Coyle finally released Lillian's wrist, she straightened her coat without a word, picked up her cane with slow, unshaken hands. Then she turned toward the growing line of people who had witnessed everything and said just loud enough they see now. The badge had no eyes, but the people did. That evening, the footage spread fast, not just on activist pages, but across parent groups, local businesses, and veterans networks. It wasn't just the act of unnecessary force. It was the way Lillian had been treated as disposable. The woman who once invested in her neighborhood had become a threat on her own sidewalk. The mayor's office issued a statement by sunrise. We are investigating the incident involving Officer Darren Coyle. The city of Atlanta takes all use of force incidents seriously. But it was too late for statements. Something deeper had broken. Mason Tran, for all his prior silence, called a press conference. He didn't use the corporate backdrop. He didn't stand behind glass. He stood outside next to Lillian in front of the same showroom where she had once been dragged by the arm. He didn't introduce her as a customer. He introduced her as a co-founder. I didn't know what I didn't want to see, Mason said, voice thick with accountability. But Lillian Carter helped build this place, and when she returned to visit what was rightfully hers, she was treated like an intruder. That cannot stand. Reporters hurled questions. Lillian said nothing. Until one reporter, a young black woman from a local paper, asked gently, "Ms. Carter, do you want an apology from the officer?" Lillian lifted her chin. "No, I want him to see me." A pause followed. Not silence. Something quieter. Respect. The footage prompted calls for change in the department. Internal Affairs was forced to act. Officer Coyle was suspended pending investigation. But Lillian didn't follow the hearings. She didn't attend the briefings. That wasn't her justice. That wasn't her purpose. Instead, she met with a group of young women from a local college who'd seen the video and wanted to know more. They asked how she'd stayed so calm. She told them, "When you've survived worse, today feels like dust." They asked how she kept walking. She said, "Because stopping never brought anything back." And then she gave them copies of the deed. "Don't just tell my story," she told them. "Know it. Then build your own." That night, someone spray painted a message on the back wall of Sterling Legacy Auto. Not crude, not vulgar, just 7 words in white block letters. She stood when no one else did. No one removed it. Mason had it sealed in plexiglass. And the next morning, when the officer returned to clear out his locker, he passed it unblinking, unreadable. But the town had already read it. The badge had no eyes, but the city had finally opened theirs. On the southern edge of Forsyth Park, where the magnolia trees cast wide shadows in the late afternoon, a new bench had been placed. It was simple oak wood, gently curved and bolted to the ground, as if meant to endure not just time, but history itself. The brass plaque fixed to its backrest bore only 6 words in honor of Lillian May Carter. There was no ribbon cutting, no speeches from city officials. The dedication was not marked by ceremony, but by presence. People gathered because they had seen her, because they had finally understood what it meant to erase someone, and more importantly, what it meant to restore them. Lillian arrived just after sunrise, wrapped in her long beige coat, the same cane in her hand, the one she had refused to replace even after it had been knocked to the ground. She walked slowly, deliberately, her granddaughter Camille by her side, holding a small folded piece of cloth in her hand. When they reached the bench, the crowd quieted. Neighbors, students, journalists, strangers, all of them stood not as an audience, but as witnesses. The moment didn't require explanation. The old woman, who had once been shoved, dismissed, nearly erased, now sat beneath the magnolias in full view of the city. She sat without words at first, closed her eyes. Let the sun fall against her cheek, and the breeze rustle the edges of her coat. She reached forward and placed both hands on the armrests, grounding herself in a place that was now undeniably hers. When she spoke, her voice was soft but firm. "This bench is not for rest. She said, "It's for remembrance." Camille unfolded the cloth in her hand. It was an old black and white photo of a woman standing in front of a gas station in 1957, young proud, dressed in a crisp skirt suit. Lillian Carter, age 23, holding a clipboard, ready to sign the deed on her first business investment. She built something, Camille said to the crowd lifting the photo for them to see. And when people tried to take it, she stood on the very ground they claimed. That's why this matters. Not because she was loud, but because she was right. A student from Spelman stepped forward. Then a woman from the local historical society. Then Mason Tran himself, quieter than he had ever been, holding a set of car keys he no longer owned. "I resigned yesterday," Mason announced. "The dealership is under new ownership. Cooperative, multifamily, and community-based. It carries her name again." Lillian didn't react with surprise. She'd seen enough of life to know that transformation doesn't always begin in the heart. Sometimes it starts in shame. But when shame leads to action, something good can still grow from it. She nodded once. "Make sure it's not a gesture," she told him. "Make sure it's a foundation." He nodded back. At that moment, a group of children ran by, laughing, chasing a soccer ball. One of them tripped, fell near Lillian's feet, looked up, and paused. She smiled down at him, helped him up with a hand rough from time, but steady as ever. He smiled back, then dashed off to his friends. That brief exchange, unnoticed by many, settled something in the air. Healing isn't always loud. Sometimes it sits still on a bench, beneath a magnolia tree, holding space for what the world almost forgot. As people began to disperse, one by one, they approached Lillian. Some shook her hand. Some just nodded. Some left small tokens. Flowers, folded letters, newspaper clippings. Marcus, the young man who had posted the original video, knelt by the bench and whispered, "Thank you for not giving up." She looked at him kindly. "I didn't know how," she said, "so I just kept showing up." When the sun lowered, casting long golden lines across the park, Camille helped Lillian to her feet. They walked away slowly, their steps in sync. Behind them, the bench stood still, bathed in soft light, already drawing new eyes, new stories. It wasn't just a seat. It was a monument to someone who never asked to be seen as a symbol, but became one nonetheless. And long after the crowd had gone, the wind whispered through the magnolia leaves like a promise she was here. She mattered. And we remember. Lillian May Carter's story began like many that go unnoticed. An aging black woman navigating the world with quiet strength and unshakable dignity. But what happened to her in that dealership in plain sight and under the cold scrutiny of white uniforms and silent bystanders was not just personal. It was historical. It was generational. And it was a mirror held up to all of us. They tried to erase her, not with violence loud enough to alarm, but with the kind of cold dismissal that's rehearsed, systemic, and dangerously normalized. Yet Lillian stood her ground not out of defiance, but out of memory. Her cane, her name, her history were not tokens of pity. They were pillars, symbols of everything she had built, survived, and quietly passed on. From the silent mockery in the showroom to the viral video that exposed the truth from a manager who almost walked away to a granddaughter who refused to stay quiet, this was never just about one moment. It was about generations of black women like Lillian, whose contributions are constantly overlooked, whose wisdom is undervalued, and whose presence is too often unwelcome in spaces they helped create. In the end, it wasn't justice delivered by institutions that restored her place. It was the community, the students, the youth, the truth tellers who refused to look away. It was the act of remembrance that turned shame into reckoning, silence into speech, and dismissal into legacy. The Magnolia Bench now stands not only as a tribute to Lillian May Carter, but as a living reminder that the past lives in our present, and dignity must never be optional. So what can we take away from her story? That the smallest acts of awareness can shift culture. That listening, truly listening to someone's lived experience can spark transformation. And that when one voice rises with truth, it makes room for others to rise with it. We are all walking past people like Lillian every day, people who carry worlds inside them. The question is, will we look away or will we see them? If Lillian's journey moved, challenged you, or opened your eyes in any way, don't let it end here. Subscribe to our channel. Share this story. Leave a comment about someone in your life who reminds you of Lillian. Because these stories matter. They deserve to be told and remembered. Your support helps us keep telling the truth, one powerful voice at a time. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. And above all, thank you for refusing to forget.